The recording equipment doesn't malfunction. The compass doesn't lie. And when something in Coronado National Forest knows your name, knows things it shouldn't, you don't ask questions. You run. Welcome to Verified Souls. Tonight, 10 encounters that turned Arizona's most beautiful wilderness into something else entirely. A geologist's sensors detecting movement from impossible depths. A wedding photographer capturing something that gets closer with every shot. A sheriff finding a journal that documents 3 years written in 3 days. Before we begin, here's what I need from you. If you make it through all 10 stories without pausing, drop "I survived Coronado" in the comments. And if you've had your own unexplainable experience in these mountains or any forest that felt wrong, share it below. Your story might be next. Subscribe to Verified Souls, because some truths don't care whether you believe them or not. Let's begin with the geologist who discovered that sometimes the ground listens back. I knew something was wrong with that canyon before I ever powered on the equipment. Not in a supernatural way, just wrong. The kind of wrong you feel in your ears before your brain catches up. No wind pushing through the rocks, no birds, no insects buzzing around my face, just a thick, heavy silence that made every small sound feel too loud. From a fieldwork perspective, it was ideal. Quiet means clean data. No trucks, no aircraft, no interference. Just the earth, talking through the sensors. That's what I told myself. Perfect conditions. I was 3 days into a solo seismic survey deep in Coronado National Forest, supposed to be mapping subtle fault lines and picking up micro tremors for the university's earthquake model. This is routine work. If you're used to it, hike in, drop the gear, log the readings, hike out. I'd been doing it for years. I trusted my instruments more than I trusted most people. That canyon sat at the end of a long, narrow wash, its walls steep and pale, with patches of exposed limestone that looked almost polished. Old rusted survey markers were drilled into the rock here and there, left behind by field teams decades before mine. I remember feeling a small bit of pride, thinking I was adding another layer of data to a place professionals had been trying to understand for generations. I shrugged off my pack, laid everything out, and slipped into that automatic, methodical mode you develop after enough days in the field. Tripod, geophone sensors, data logger, cables. I planted the first spike firmly into the ground, felt the usual faint vibration through my boot. Nothing unusual. The earth is never truly still. I set the rest of the sensors in a spread pattern, connected them, powered on the logger, and watched the live feed appear on the tablet. At first, it looked like every other baseline. A low, jittering line of background noise, the heartbeat of distant tectonic motion, the subtle shift of rock under pressure. Then I noticed it. The noise floor was higher than it should have been. Not chaotic, not messy, just elevated. I zoomed in, adjusted the scale, and realized there was a rhythm. Natural seismic data doesn't usually look neat. It's random spikes, long curves, overlapping frequencies. This was sharp, distinct, and evenly spaced. Peaks, 4 seconds apart, over and over. I checked the surroundings automatically. No roads nearby, no active mines, no construction, no blasting schedule in the area. According to my map, I was miles from anything man-made other than those rusted markers in the rock. The canyon itself curved just enough to cut off any real line of sight to the outside world. It was just me, the rock, and the sensors. I told myself it had to be something natural. Maybe groundwater moving through some hidden cavern system. Maybe an undocumented void underground. The idea of discovering something like that was exciting. That was my first mistake, thinking of it as an opportunity instead of a warning. I decided to see how the readings changed if I moved. I took the tablet with me and started walking deeper into the canyon, leaving the array behind, cables stretching back to the logger. As I moved, I watched the waveform. The interval stayed the same 4 seconds, but the intensity shifted. The spikes grew taller, more defined, the deeper I went. When I turned and walked back toward the equipment, they weakened. I tested it a few times, pacing forward and backward, like an idiot in a lab coat. Step deeper, stronger signal. Step back, weaker. It felt like something down there was tracking, reacting. Not to sound, not to my voice, not to anything obvious. Just to my position. The first real crack in my confidence came when I stopped moving entirely. I stood still, tablet in hand, and stared at that line. The spikes didn't fade. They didn't fall back into normal random noise. They hesitated for just a breath, then resumed at a faster tempo, 3 seconds apart now. I checked the internal clock, checked the lag, checked the connections. Everything was functioning normally. I'd tested this gear 100 times. I knew how glitches looked. This wasn't one of them. For a moment, I just stood there with my mouth dry, telling myself that I was tired, overworked, and reading intention into a pattern that wasn't really there. That's a huge danger in this line of work, seeing faces in the static, meaning in the noise. So I forced myself to keep going deeper into the canyon, even though every instinct was starting to lean toward leaving. The deeper I went, the tighter the canyon felt. The walls rose higher, narrowing the strip of sky above me, and the light shifted to that cold, flat shade that makes it hard to judge time. The air temperature dropped slightly. My footsteps echoed just a bit too sharp against the rock. The signal followed me, growing more intense, the spikes pressing closer together. I felt like I was being drawn into the throat of something, even though that thought was ridiculous. When I finally stopped and turned around, intending to go back and call it for the day, the interval dropped again. 2 seconds. No gradual shift, just an instant change in pace. I didn't want to admit that it felt like a response. I made myself walk back to the main array, focusing on practical things. Light was fading. I had a limited window before the canyon floor went dark. I needed to secure gear, log coordinates, flag the site. Normal, rational concerns. But the closer I got to the equipment, the more the canyon's silence started to feel less like an absence and more like a tension. By the time I reached the array, the last of the direct sunlight had pulled off the rock. Everything around me was dipped in shadow, with the sky still bright above. I checked the tablet again. The pattern had changed. Instead of identical spikes at regular intervals, the line had shifted into groups. 3 strong peaks. Pause. 3 strong peaks. Pause. Again and again. It was organized, structured. If you've ever looked at data long enough, you know when something stops being random. This wasn't just the earth shifting. It looked like a sequence. That's when the word signal pushed its way into my mind. It felt stupid to even think it, but I couldn't shake it. Something under me wasn't just moving, it was doing something. Up to that point, I still thought I'd walk away feeling lucky. Strange data meant interesting findings. Unexplained patterns meant funding, papers, conferences. I didn't feel lucky anymore. I just wanted a record to bring back. So I did something I've come to regret. I set up a separate digital audio recorder near the center of the array, pointed the mic toward the ground, and synced its timecode with the data logger. Normally, audio is just a tool to identify surface noise, planes, trucks, people yelling, anything that might contaminate a reading. That's all I expected. I just wanted redundancy. I hit record. The tiny red light blinked on. The canyon didn't change. No sound suddenly rose up from the rock. No dramatic event, just a low hiss of natural ambience in my headphones when I tested the line. But the tablet showed the underground pattern still running in those neat, unnerving groups of 3. After a few minutes, another faint pattern began to appear on the audio waveform. A very low, subtle vibration. Not something I could consciously hear, but there, in the data. It aligned perfectly with the deeper spikes from the seismographs. 3 faint surface ripples. 3 strong underground peaks. Pause. Repeating. Layered together. The air around me felt thicker. That's the only way to describe it. Like the canyon had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. The last direct light vanished, and shadows swallowed the equipment. The sky above the rim was still bright, but down on the floor with the gear, it felt like evening. And that's when everything escalated. The pattern on the tablet stopped repeating in tidy sets of 3. There was a brief pause, a kind of flat line, and then the entire graph surged. Every sensor lit up. The amplitude shot off the chart. It looked like something vast had started to move directly beneath me, sweeping through every geophone at once. My first thought was earthquake, but my body told me otherwise. The ground under my boots was steady. No tremor, no shake. The gravel didn't shift. The cables didn't rattle. It was like watching waves on a monitor that weren't happening in the physical world. as if whatever was moving down there wasn't interacting with the surface the way it should. That disconnect triggered a different kind of fear. It meant my instruments were capturing something real enough to register, but not real enough to behave like anything I understood. I grabbed the audio recorder without even thinking about it, and realized something without changing the volume, without touching the settings. I could feel a subtle vibration in my chest now. You know how it feels when you're standing near a big subwoofer that's turned down low? You don't really hear it as much as you feel it in your ribs. That's what it reminded me of. The audio waveform showed the sound thickening into a more defined structure. I couldn't make it out in real time, but looking at the shape, I recognized the signature. Slow, long, cyclical rising and falling. Breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate breathing. That was the moment the scientific part of my brain finally shut up. Curiosity got bulldozed by survival. I didn't bother disconnecting the array properly. I didn't pack the sensors carefully. I yanked a few cables, grabbed the tablet and the recorder, and left the rest where it was. I walked fast at first, then realized I'd started running without deciding to. My own footsteps sounded wrong, too loud, like the canyon was exaggerating them. The idea that something below me was listening to those impacts wouldn't leave my head. It felt like walking across a thin sheet of glass with something huge just under the surface. I didn't look back. I followed my GPS and my memory. Counting the turns in the canyon. Watching the sky narrow, then widen again. When I finally saw the dull, familiar shape of my truck tucked between the rocks, that cold knot in my stomach loosened just enough for me to breathe properly. I threw the gear into the cab in a way that would have gotten me chewed out in any lab, slammed the door, and drove until the canyon was out of sight. Later, back at the university, people listened to the files and reviewed the data. On paper, it could be explained away. Instrument failure, software glitches, environmental interference, the usual list. But when the audio was cleaned up, when the low frequencies were amplified and isolated, it stopped sounding like interference. Everyone in that room agreed on one thing. There was a pattern. A clear, deep, slow rhythm that matched almost perfectly with those violent spikes underground. It sounded like breathing rising through stone. The part most of them never heard is what happens when you analyze the lowest band of that recording, buried beneath even that pulsing breath. There's a secondary pattern, not speech, not language as we know it, but a series of impacts. Soft, regular, echoing in a way that doesn't match any known surface noise. When I synced that track with my own location data from that day, the timing lined up almost perfectly. Step for step, impact for impact. The deeper I walked into the canyon, the stronger that secondary pattern became. Almost like something under all that rock wasn't just moving, it was matching me. You know how people always say cameras never lie? Spend enough time behind one, and you learn that's not true. Cameras lie all the time. Lenses distort, sensors glitch, light tricks your brain. I used to take comfort in that. If something looked off in a photo, there was always a technical reason. At least, that's what I believed. Until that afternoon in Coronado National Forest, standing in a meadow that should have been the perfect backdrop for the happiest day of someone's life. I was there to do what I've done 100 times. Shoot wedding portraits. Nothing dramatic, nothing strange. Just a small, budget-conscious couple who decided to skip fancy venues and head into the forest for natural, cinematic photos. They'd sent me Instagram screenshots, sunset, wild grass, pine silhouettes, mountains in the distance. Those inspo photos came from a spot in the bare Wallow area, a meadow tucked between tall ponderosa pines, high enough to catch that golden light that makes everything look like a memory. The kind of place influencers flock to. The kind of place you don't associate with dread. We hiked in later than I would have liked. Traffic, last-minute makeup issues, the usual wedding day chaos. By the time we reached the meadow, the sun was already starting its slow slide toward the ridge, painting everything in warm, honey-colored light. The air was still. No wind in the grass, no rustle in the trees. Just the three of us, and that big, open sky. It was quiet, but not in a threatening way. At first, it felt peaceful, ideal. I set my bag down in the grass and did what I always do. Checked angles, checked light, took a few test shots to dial in exposure. The couple stood off to the side, laughing, fixing the dress, smoothing out nervous energy. I snapped a few frames of the empty meadow just to get my settings right. Horizon straight, background clean, no lens flare. Everything looked perfect. The forest around us was that deep, rich green you only get at higher elevation in Arizona, where the desert finally gives way to real trees and real shadows. We started with basic poses, hands linked, foreheads touching, the groom behind the bride, arms around her waist, as they both looked out over the valley. Classic stuff. I kept up the small talk, the wedding photographer chatter that keeps people relaxed. Tilt your chin this way. Perfect. Keep your eyes on me. Great. Don't worry about your hair. The light's doing you a favor right now. I shot, checked the back of the camera, adjusted, shot again. Everything felt routine. It wasn't until maybe 10 minutes in that I noticed something odd. I was reviewing a set of shots on the camera's screen between poses, scrolling through quickly to check sharpness. Sun behind them, soft lens flare, warm tones. Exactly what I wanted. But near the top edge of one frame, in the background between two trees, there was a faint, pale smudge. At first, I thought it was just lens flare or a bit of overexposed sky. Nothing unusual. The sun does weird things sometimes when it catches the glass just right. I almost skipped past it. Almost. But something about the shape pulled at me. It wasn't the usual circular flare. It had more structure to it. Vertical, narrow, lighter than the trees behind it, but not as bright as the sky. I zoomed in. The pixels broke apart like they always do when you push too far, but even then, the shape didn't look random. It looked like a person. Just a faint, off-white silhouette standing dead still at the tree line. I remember glancing up immediately, squinting toward those same trees. There was nothing there. Just bark, needles, shadows. No pale figure, no person, no movement at all. That's when you start explaining things away. Maybe it's a blown highlight. Maybe it's something weird in the dynamic range. Maybe that old lens filter needs a cleaning. The brain loves rational explanations, especially when you're in the middle of a paid job where the last thing you can afford to do is spook your clients. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to freak them out over what I assumed was nothing. I told them to move a few steps to the right, then had them hold hands and walk slowly through the grass while I shot in burst mode. It's a trick I love, turns stiffness into natural movement. They laughed, tripped over each other, bumped shoulders. Very real, very candid. I followed them with the camera, tracking their path through the meadow. Later, scrolling through those shots on the back of the camera, my stomach dropped. The pale shape was back. Same height, same narrow outline, still standing at the tree line, but closer now. Not dramatically, not like it had leapt forward, just a few meters nearer. Close enough that the general proportions were clearer. A long, light-colored figure, almost like someone wearing an old-fashioned dress or suit, washed out by the exposure. No defined face, no recognizable features, just presence. Again, I looked up from the camera, eyes straining at the trees. Nothing. No one. I checked the trail we'd come in on. We were alone. My ears started picking up the silence in a different way now. Not peaceful, just empty. No birdsong. No distant hikers, no wind, just the faint, muffled sound of my own breath. I told myself it had to be a reflection, some kind of internal reflection, bouncing around inside the lens. It can happen, ghost images layered over the real scene. But I've seen that before. It doesn't behave like this. It doesn't get closer from shot to shot. It doesn't stay in the same relative spot while the subjects move. I forced myself to keep working. Time was running out. Golden hour only lasts so long, and I had to deliver. I had them do more poses. A forehead kiss, a twirl, a quiet moment with their foreheads touching. I changed position a few times, adjusted angles, backed up, moved left, moved right. Part of me was hoping that whatever artifact I was seeing would disappear if I changed my vantage point. Another part of me was terrified it wouldn't. It didn't. The next time I really looked, really stopped and examined the photos, my fingers actually went cold. Same figure, same pale outline, but now it was no longer at the edge of the meadow. It was in the meadow, behind them, maybe 15 or 20 feet back, standing amid the grass, perfectly upright, facing the camera. No motion blur, no distortion from movement. It was as if it had been there the whole time we'd been shooting. Here's the part I keep getting stuck on, even now. Nothing in the environment reflected that presence. No shadow, no displaced grass, no break in the continuity of light. In the actual physical space, there was nothing behind them. I checked. I turned around. I walked that section of meadow while they adjusted clothes and fixed hair. The grass was undisturbed. The air still felt dead, like the whole place was holding its breath. I told them to take a short break and pretend to chat while I checked exposure. I stepped away, turned my back to them so they wouldn't see my expression, and scrolled through every frame I'd taken in that meadow. The figure was not in the very first shots. It appeared during the early poses at the tree line, faint and distant. Then, gradually, logically, step by step, it moved closer every few photos. Not in smooth motion, but in jumps like frames from a stop-motion sequence. Always the same posture, upright, facing the camera, slightly blurred at the edges but unmistakably human-shaped. On one shot, my own reflection was faintly visible in a piece of glass on my lens filter. I saw my hand steady, my posture normal. Nothing about me suggested I was aware of anything unusual in the moment that frame was taken. But there it was, in the background, behind the couple, closer now, maybe 10 feet. If it had been real, if it had been a person physically there, we should have seen it. We should have heard the footsteps in the grass. They should have felt someone behind them. They never reacted. Not once. Not a turned head. Not a shift of eyes. Nothing. The sun dropped lower. Shadows lengthened. Something in my gut kicked hard like an animal. I made the call to wrap early. I used the only excuse I could think of that wouldn't alarm them. We've got more than enough, and I want to make sure we get out before the light dies completely. They agreed, relieved to head back to the trail. Before we left the meadow, I took one last shot of them. Just a quick, casual frame. More out of habit than anything else. I didn't look at that last photo until I was back at my car. I sat in the driver's seat, key in the ignition, camera still on. The forest around me felt normal again. Other cars nearby, distant voices, the illusion of safety that comes from being closer to the parking lot. I scrolled backwards to that final frame, the one I'd taken in a hurry as they laughed and turned toward the path. They were both in focus, smiling, slightly backlit by the last leftovers of golden light. Compositionally, it was perfect. And directly behind the bride's right shoulder, closer than it had ever been, that pale figure stood, no longer vague. Faintly defined clothing outdated, like something from an old black and white photo. One narrow, translucent hand rested lightly on her shoulder, fingers long and oddly too straight, as if they didn't quite understand how to curl naturally. She hadn't flinched, hadn't shivered, hadn't turned. There was no sign, no visible cue that anything was touching her. That's when the rational explanations finally ran out. I delivered the photos a week later. After doing everything I could to salvage the set, I removed, cropped, or discarded every frame where the figure appeared. I told myself I was being professional, not protective. The couple never saw what the camera had really captured in that meadow. They thanked me, left a glowing review, and went on with their lives. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. About a month later, the messages started. First, from the bride, short at first, then longer. Headaches, nightmares. Waking up in the dark, with the sickening feeling that someone was standing right beside the bed. The sensation of a hand on her shoulder, so real she could feel the pressure, but no one there when she turned on the light. She asked if we'd passed any poisonous plants, if maybe she'd picked up some weird fungus or infection in the forest. I had no answers I could give her, without sounding insane. I started digging into the history of that meadow instead, because I needed to know if what happened had a context or if it was just some freak, isolated thing. What I found weren't official reports, not police records or documented cases, just whispers. Old forum posts, half-forgotten local comments about a wedding party attacked near that area in the early 1900s, an ex-lover who showed up armed, a bride never making it to the ceremony. A photograph that people swore used to hang in a local building, an old portrait where, if you looked closely, someone stood behind the bride that shouldn't have been there. The details were muddy, distorted by time and rumor. I never found that original photo. Maybe it doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never did. But I know what my camera picked up that day, frame by frame. I know how it started, distant and harmless, just a glitch in the background. And I know how it ended, with a hand pressed to a shoulder that never felt it. People ask if I still do outdoor weddings. Yes, they pay well. They're in demand. But I never go back to that meadow in Coronado. And when couples insist on forest locations, there's one rule I follow obsessively. I check every single frame on site. Not just for focus, not just for exposure, but for anything that's standing behind them, getting just a little closer every time I press the shutter. Have you ever been so sure of your direction that getting lost doesn't even feel possible? Not just confident, absolute. GPS locked, compass steady, landmarks clear. That's how I felt walking into that grove in the Coronado National Forest. I didn't wander into it scared. I walked in like I owned it, clipboard in hand, GPS on my pack strap, decades of field experience in my head. I knew where I was going, or at least, I thought I did. I was in the Miller Peak Wilderness, working on a long-term study about fungal networks and how climate change affects decomposition. It sounds dry when you say it that way, but if you've ever been in a dense forest after rain, you know decay is life, rot is movement. The forest is supposed to be full of it. Logs collapsing in on themselves, mushrooms eating their way through old stumps, the smell of damp earth, and slow breakdown. That messy, beautiful cycle was my specialty. I'd been studying it for 20 years. I knew what normal looked like. I knew what sick looked like. I was not prepared for what wrong looked like. That morning, the clouds were low and solid, making the forest feel enclosed. Fog clung to the ground in shallow pockets between trees. The air was cool, colder than the forecast had suggested. I'd already hit a couple of survey points earlier in the day. They were textbook: fallen logs soft and wet, bark peeling back, fruiting bodies of fungi branching out in delicate fans and clusters. My datasheets were filling up exactly the way they should. The grove I'm talking about, I didn't even mark it as special at first. On the map, it was just another patch of denser tree cover along my planned route. No red flags, no warnings. Just a darker smear of green on the satellite image. I stepped into it without ceremony, like stepping from one room into another. One moment, the forest around me was busy and familiar. The next, it felt like the world had been muted. The change was subtle, but immediate. The air felt heavier and colder, the way it does when you walk into a basement that hasn't been opened in years. The sound changed too. Outside, I could hear distant bird calls, leaves rustling, occasional branches creaking. Inside that grove, everything sounded trapped. My footsteps on the leaf litter sounded too loud. The soft click of my pen on the clipboard rang in my ears. It was like the grove was listening. I told myself I was being dramatic, and got to work. The first fallen log I checked stopped me cold. From the outside, it looked normal enough, bark intact, slight sag where it rested on two rocks, a few scratches from animals. But when I tapped it with my boot, it made a sound I wasn't expecting. Not the soft thud of wet wood. A harder, hollower sound. Like knocking on an old table. I knelt down, slipped my knife under the bark, and pried a strip back. The inside was dry. Not hasn't rained for a while, dry. Completely dry. Pale. Clean. No mycelium. No insect tunnels. No beetles scurrying away from the sudden light. It was like the log had been cut and left there yesterday, except the growth rings told a different story. This tree had been dead for years, maybe decades, and there was not a single sign that anything had tried to break it down. I moved to the next one. Same thing. Bark intact, interior dry, untouched by decay. No mold, no rot. I started scanning the ground around me. Every log, every fallen branch, every stump, the same eerie preservation. Nothing was soft. Nothing crumbled when I pressed it. Nothing yielded to pressure. It was like walking through a room full of perfectly preserved props, meant to look like a forest, not an actual forest floor. That's when a little part of my brain started whispering. There should be something here. Anything. Ants. Beetles. A hint of fungus. Instead, there was nothing. The leaf litter under my boots didn't have that damp give to it. It felt almost crisp, but didn't crackle. Every time I knelt, I expected the smell of rich, wet decomposition. but the air was oddly neutral. Cold and neutral. Sterile. I took samples anyway. That's what you do when something doesn't make sense. I clipped pieces of bark, sliced out cross-sections of dead wood, scraped the interior with sterile swabs. Label, bag, record. My hands went through the motions almost automatically, while the rest of me was trying to catch up with the unease creeping in. I checked the temperature on my handheld device. It read almost 15 degrees colder than it had just outside the grove. Instruments don't get spooked, I told myself. They just report. When I finished the initial checks, I decided to mark my entry point and push deeper into the grove. I pulled a roll of bright orange flagging tape from my pack, tied a strip around a low-hanging branch near where I'd stepped in, and marked it on my GPS. That's what made what happened next impossible to ignore, because I had data, coordinates, physical markers, proof. I picked a direction that would keep me roughly aligned with my planned route and started walking. The grove wasn't huge, maybe a couple 100 meters across, unless the map was off. The trees were densely spaced, but not so much that I had to force my way through. I walked, weaving between trunks, noting the same disturbing pattern everywhere. Dead material that refused to decay. No mushrooms, no soft spots, no insects. After what felt like 10 or 15 minutes, I decided to loop back toward the entry flag and check my position. I didn't want to lose track of the boundaries of this anomaly. I turned, used the GPS arrow to orient myself, and followed the line it gave me back toward where I'd started. When that spot finally came into view, my first thought was, good, there's the flag. A small flicker of orange between the trees. I stepped out from behind a trunk, ready to mark the edge of the grove on my map. Then my brain had to backtrack, rewind the last few minutes, and replay what I'd just seen. The flag was not ahead of me. It was exactly where I had just been standing. For a long second, the two images wouldn't resolve. I turned in place slowly. The grove was still around me, silent, motionless. The orange tape fluttered gently on the branch, even though I hadn't felt any wind. My GPS insisted I had walked a rough loop. The track it showed wasn't broken, wasn't glitching. It traced a path starting at that point, arcing outward, then returning. According to the device, I'd moved in a circle. But in my body, in my sense of space, I'd been walking straight. I told myself I'd misjudged. Trees can play tricks on you. Landmarks blend together. I took a breath, dropped a second strip of flagging tape on the ground at my feet, marked a fresh waypoint, and tried again. This time, I kept my eyes on the compass. North. Just walk north. Count steps. Note the terrain. Old habits. I pushed forward, passing between a pair of twisted trunks that I was sure I'd never seen before. I chose them deliberately as mental markers. When you see those again, I told myself, you'll know you've looped. I walked for several minutes, counting under my breath. The grove did not visibly change. Same preserved logs, same stiff branches, same dead silence. The air never warmed. The light didn't shift. At step 200, I stopped, checked the compass, still pointing me north, and then checked the GPS. The screen showed me standing almost directly on top of my previous waypoint. I looked up. The two twisted trunks were right in front of me. My stomach dropped in a slow, heavy way. Not a jump scare. More like realizing the elevator floor isn't where it should be. I turned my head to the left, and there, exactly where I knew it would be now, was the orange flag. The first one. The second strip of tape I dropped on the ground was at my feet. I had done everything right. Marked my entry, logged coordinates, used a compass, walked in a straight line. And the forest, this small, impossible patch of forest, had quietly folded my path back onto itself without me noticing. It didn't feel like getting lost. Getting lost is messy, you feel it happening, you hesitate, you second guess, your body knows. This felt smooth, seamless. Like the grove itself had gently picked me up and set me back where I started. All while letting me believe I was moving forward. Your brain doesn't have a built-in reaction for that, not right away. Mine tried to rationalize it. Maybe the GPS was malfunctioning. Maybe it lost signal. I checked the sky through the branches. Cloud cover, yes, but nothing unusual. The GPS had a clear enough view. The satellite icon was solid. The accuracy reading was normal. The compass needle was steady. For the first time that day, I felt a physical pulse of fear. I decided to get out, not finish the survey, not push my luck, just leave. I didn't care if it meant losing an afternoon of data. The forest is supposed to be big, chaotic, organic. It's not supposed to behave like a looped corridor. I picked a new direction, not north, not the same route, just a direction that felt different. I told myself I would walk for 5 solid minutes without checking anything, then stop and reorient. I started moving, walking faster now, boots thudding against the unyielding, too dry ground. I counted each minute on my watch. 1 passed, 2, 3. My legs started to ache. The grove did not thin. The preserved wood did not change. No saplings, no gap in the trees, no edge. At minute 5, I stopped and turned slowly, breathing hard in that cold, heavy air. The orange flag was hanging 10 feet away. I can't really describe what that did to me in that moment. The fear wasn't sharp, it was thick, dense. It settled in my chest and made it hard to breathe. I wasn't just turned around. Something in that space refused to let me leave. Quietly, patiently, without any visible movement, it was folding distance, erasing my forward progress, bending my path into a circle. I looked down at the ground, searching for my own footprints, trying to prove to myself this was just perception, that I'd been spiraling inward without realizing. But the leaf litter, the scattered needles, the light layer of dirt, they didn't tell that story. I could see my most recent prints from where I stood. But further out, where I should have seen a messy trail of my circling, there was nothing clear enough to untangle. The ground looked undisturbed in all directions, like no one had walked there in years. The thought that came next wasn't rational, but it felt true. If you let this place keep you until dark, you are not getting out. I did something then that went against every instinct I had as a researcher. I stopped trusting my instruments. I turned the GPS off. I put the compass in my pocket. I closed my eyes. It sounds stupid. It sounds like exactly the wrong thing to do. But standing there with that tape fluttering near me again, I had this sudden, overwhelming sense that the more I tried to navigate logically, the easier I was making it for whatever this was to fold my steps back onto themselves, like I was walking along a grid it controlled. So I shut it all out. I picked a direction based on nothing but the faintest tug in my gut, the one that said, away. Then I walked with my eyes closed, one arm slightly outstretched, forcing my body to move in a line that wasn't constantly checking, adjusting, compensating. Every few steps, my shoulder brushed bark. Branches snagged my jacket. Roots caught my boots. I stumbled more in those next few minutes than I had all day. The grove seemed to push back, throwing small obstacles in my way, pulling at my clothes. But I didn't stop. I didn't correct. I just kept going. When I finally opened my eyes, the light looked different. Not much, but enough. The air didn't feel as sharp in my lungs. The trees weren't as densely packed. I looked around slowly. No orange flag. I turned in a full circle. No flag. No familiar twisted trunks. The logs around me looked wrong in a different way. They were soft. My boots sank slightly when I stepped on one. I kicked at the dirt and watched a small puff of darker, damp soil break free. There were fungus caps on a rotting stump nearby, exactly where they should be. I had no idea which direction the grove was now. There was no visible border, no clear line where normal returned, but I knew I'd crossed something. It was like stepping out of a freezer. You don't see the cold when you walk out, but you feel it recede. It wasn't until I got home and processed the samples that the last piece of wrongness clicked into place. The wood I'd collected from the grove behaved like nothing I'd ever seen. Microscopic structure. Perfect. No fungal invasion. No bacterial damage. No insect galleries. When we tried to sequence its DNA, the machine kept throwing errors. The third run produced results that didn't match anything in the database, not because it was new, but because it was inconsistent. Every attempt gave a different sequence, as if the material couldn't decide what it was. The kicker? The outer bark from the same samples read completely normal. The inside was something else. I haven't been able to replicate that grove. I've gone back to Miller Peak, carefully, with teams, with backup, with more gear than anyone really needs. I've never found that exact patch again. It's like it sealed itself behind me after I left. Maybe it did. Maybe that grove only opens when it wants to keep something. Or someone. So when people tell me they got turned around in the forest, walked in circles without meaning to, passed the same tree 3 times and thought they were just tired, I don't correct them. I don't tell them about the place I found where decay doesn't happen and time doesn't move the way it should. I just tell them this. If you ever find yourself in a part of the woods where nothing rots, where your footsteps sound too loud and the air feels heavy and cold, no matter the season, don't trust your compass. Don't trust your GPS. Get out. Because there are places in Coronado National Forest that don't just confuse you, they keep you. You ever come across something that technically fits the report, but your gut tells you it shouldn't exist the way you're seeing it? That's what this was like. On paper, it was just a follow-up on an old missing person case in Coronado National Forest. Dead file, no active leads, no family calling every day, just a loose end the department wanted checked off. Simple hike in, document what a hunter said he found, hike out. I'd done worse on a Sunday. The call came in March, just after the snow started melting in the Chiricahua Mountains near Rucker Canyon. A hunter had stumbled on what he thought might be an old camp tent, gear, the works half buried under the winter's snowpack. The coordinates he gave matched roughly where a missing hiker's last ping had come from about 6 months earlier. Same general area, same side of the canyon. It sounded like a long shot, but not impossible. Snow covers a lot, and sometimes it gives things back. I remember the drive more than I should. The sky was that hard, clear blue, that makes the mountains look farther away than they are. The air was crisp, not bitter cold, just enough to sting the lungs a little. I parked as close as I could on a rough forest road, then hiked in the rest of the way. Dry oak, patches of snow in the shade, rock underfoot. It was quiet, but in the normal way. No bad feeling, no dramatic warning, just that familiar wilderness hush. The hunter's coordinates were good. I didn't have to search long before I saw the shape of a tent through the trees. Faded fabric, half collapsed, edges still spread where the snow had weighed it down. Gear scattered nearby in that way that always looks chaotic until you get closer and realize it's not. People have patterns even in how they make a mess. I approached slow, listening, scanning. Old habit. You don't just walk into a scene without your brain in record mode. The tent wasn't destroyed, but time and weather had taken a bite out of it. The zipper was halfway down. One corner was pinned under a rock that must have shifted during the melt. A camping stove lay on its side. A metal mug, still upright, with a dusting of frozen debris inside. It looked like someone had planned to stay a while. The first thing that really set my nerves on edge was the calendar. Just a small, spiral-bound one, hanging from a bit of paracord at the entry of the tent. I noticed it because my gloved hand brushed it, and it swung gently in the still air. The top page was marked with neat, small handwriting days crossed off, notes in the margins. I stepped inside to get out of the wind, ducking automatically, and glanced closer at that calendar without really thinking about it. The first month matched almost exactly with the date the missing hiker had gone in. Little notes. Arrived. Set camp. First night cold, but good. Then, as my eyes moved down, the pattern continued. Weeks turned into months. The pages kept flipping forward. 3 months. 6. 9. Someone had been marking off days long after that first week. The last page that had writing on it was almost exactly 3 years from the starting point. A neat, circled number on what was clearly meant to be day 1095. A little note scribbled under it. 3 years, still here. I remember my hand going still on the calendar. 3 years. That didn't line up with anything. The missing hiker had been reported overdue 6 days after his planned return. We'd searched. We'd flown helicopters. We'd had dogs on the ground. 6 months had passed since that search, not 3 years. I told myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe the guy had brought an old calendar. Maybe he'd filled it in as some kind of mental exercise. Maybe the dates weren't meant to be literal. But the entries told a different story. I started reading. The early entries were what you'd expect. Weather, trail notes, a few lines here and there about enjoying the solitude. Mentions of specific birds, a fox sighting, the way the stars looked one night with no moon. Then something shifted. Around what he had marked as week 2, the tone changed. The entry read, tried to head back to truck. Walked for 6 hours. Ended up here again. Must have misjudged the route. We'll try again tomorrow. A few days later, left at sunrise. Followed the washdown like before. Canyon splits. Took the other branch this time. Still ended up here. GPS says I'm moving, but I'm not getting anywhere. My shoulders tightened as I scanned further down the page. The words started coming faster. Shorter sentences. More frustration bleeding through. Something's wrong with directions here. Compass fine. Sky fine. Land is not. I keep seeing the same rock formations. Same dead tree with the split trunk. Marked a boulder with spray paint. Walked 4 hours in one direction. Found the same boulder. On the next month's page, the cracks widened. I think I'm stuck in some kind of loop. Tried walking in a straight line. Used the sun. Sun went behind clouds. Same tree again. Rationing food. Shouldn't have to. I should be able to leave. According to the calendar, months were passing. The handwriting changed slowly over time. Neat at first, then shakier. More pressured as if written with cold, tense fingers. There were notes about hunting, about finding water, about makeshift traps. A detailed account of how many meals he could stretch from a single small animal. Drawings of the surrounding rock formations, repeated, as if he kept coming back to the same places, whether he wanted to or not. Everything about his routine suggested someone who believed, wholeheartedly, that he had been out there for far longer than a week. The kind of slow, grinding survival you read about in long-term isolation cases. Except, he hadn't. I stepped back out of the tent and did what I should have done right away. I searched. His remains weren't far. 200 yards downhill, half hidden under scrub, where the snowmelt had thinned. Body position suggested he'd simply lain down. No obvious trauma. No signs of animal activity beyond what happens after. No broken bones that I could see. Just a person who'd curled in on himself against the cold and never gotten back up. We flagged the area and called it in. The medical examiner did what they do. Time of death estimate came back, and that's when the whole thing lost any chance at normal. He hadn't been out there for 3 years. He hadn't even been out there for 3 months. Based on condition, weather, insect activity, and a dozen other small forensic details, they estimated he died within days of his last known contact. Maybe a week, at most, from when he'd told his family he was heading into the forest. Those calendar entries, those year 2 and year 3 notes, had been written in that final stretch. What he believed were 2nd and 3rd years in the forest had been compressed into his last 72 hours. At first, people leaned toward the obvious answer. Mental break. Maybe he'd gotten lost, panicked, started confusing days, losing track of time. Isolation does that. Hunger does that. Sleep deprivation definitely does that. But here's the thing that gnawed at me. His entries were too detailed, too consistent. He logged specific weather patterns that matched recorded conditions spread over what he believed were months. He wrote about phases of the moon, cloud cover, shifts in temperature that lined up eerily well with recorded fluctuations over a shorter window. He wasn't rambling, he was documenting. And mixed in with those notes were things that made my skin crawl. This canyon is wrong. I walked north all day. Sun says I'm right. Came back to camp from the south. My tracks from yesterday are gone, but I'm the only one here. Sometimes I hear branches breaking at night, right outside the tent. No prints in the morning. On the day he labeled Year 3, Day 1, his entry was almost painfully clear. I don't think time is working right here. I dream of home. I wake up and the fire is still burning like I never slept. I walk for hours and the sun doesn't move. Or it jumps. It was morning, then late afternoon, no in between. I think the forest is cheating. Cheating. Not confusing, not disorienting. Cheating. As if the landscape itself was altering the rules, cutting out pieces of his day, thinning the borders between one moment and the next until he had no idea how long he'd truly been there. His final entry was on that circled 3-year mark. The handwriting shook so badly, the letters were jagged, but it was still legible. No long paragraphs, just a few lines. I've tried every direction. I've followed my own tracks until they disappeared. Today I'm going to try something else. I'm going to walk away from camp without looking back. Not once, not even to check. If this place is looping me, maybe it needs me to look, to think about where I am. If you're reading this, it didn't work. We found his body facing away from the camp. He was lying on his side, curled against the cold, like he'd climbed into an invisible bed and given up. His head was turned slightly downward, his eyes were closed. In the days after, I went back over everything. The initial missing person report, the timeline, the search grids, the weather logs. I talked to the others who'd been on the original search, asked if anyone remembered anything strange about compasses or GPS readings. Most of them shook their heads, a few hesitated, then admitted their units had acted up in small, dismissible ways. Jumping coordinates, paths not recording properly, nothing big enough to flag at the time. When we brought up the calendar and journal at the department, it split the room. Some said he'd simply lost his mind under the pressure of being lost. Others said it didn't matter how he experienced it. What mattered was what the evidence said. He died within days of going missing. For me, those two truths never stopped grinding against each other. He thought he'd been there for years. The forest killed him in days. You can argue about perception, about how stress stretches time, about how the mind can exaggerate and distort. But standing at that campsite, with that calendar flipping under my fingers, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time on a job. The sense that whatever happened there wasn't just inside his head. It felt like the place itself had been playing with him, stretching his experience, folding it, inflating it, making each hour feel like weeks, each night like a winter. If you experience 3 years of fear and confusion in 3 days, does it matter which number is on the calendar? So when people ask why I don't like taking missing persons cases in that part of Coronado anymore, I don't tell them the official line. I don't talk about resources or priorities or protocol. I remember that tent, that neat little calendar with 3 years of marks squeezed into a handful of days. I remember that last sentence, written by a man who thought the forest was aware of him, reacting to him, bending his path on purpose. And I tell them the only thing that still feels honest. Some places won't just let you get lost. They'll make sure you feel every second of it, no matter how little time you actually have left. My job was to be the calm in everyone else's chaos. The call came in on a blistering July day in the Santa Catalina side of Coronado, near Romero Canyon. Monsoon clouds were building up over the mountains, but the heat hadn't broken yet. The dispatcher's voice crackled in my ear. Young female hiker, alone, disoriented, thinks she's off trail, plenty of water, but panicking. Her GPS coordinates put her on a steep section of rocky terrain, known for messing with people who underestimate the heat. It sounded straightforward. I'd done harder. I remember feeling almost eager. It was one of my first solo responses since getting full SAR certification. No training observer with me, no partner, just me, my radio, and a stranger relying on me to show up. The first part of the hike went exactly by the book. The sun beat down hard, radiating off the rock. The air shimmered in waves. My shirt was soaked through in minutes, sweat evaporating almost instantly in the 100-plus-degree heat. I hit the canyon floor, then climbed up through boulder fields, following the coordinates the dispatcher had relayed. I could hear distant thunder far to the east, but the sky above me was still mostly clear, that brutal Arizona blue. When I finally spotted her, she was exactly where the GPS said she would be, sitting on a flat rock in a little pocket of shade, hugging her knees to her chest. She had a small day pack, good boots, and a half-empty water bottle beside her. No visible injuries, just a tired, sun-reddened person who looked more annoyed than terrified. "Hey," I called out as I approached, slowing so I wouldn't startle her. "Search and rescue. You called for help?" She looked up at me and frowned like I'd just said something that made no sense. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her voice wasn't hoarse from screaming or crying. It sounded remarkably steady. "You're the one who needed help." That threw me off more than I expected. I laughed awkwardly and chalked it up to heat confusion. "No, I'm your response. You called 911 about being lost. I'm here to walk you out." She shook her head slowly. "I called because I found you." For a second, everything in my brain just blanked. The canyon, the heat, the hike, it all felt suddenly distant, like I'd stepped sideways out of myself. I swallowed, recentered, and tried again. "Walk me through your day," I said, slipping into protocol. "From when you parked to when you called." She watched me closely, eyes narrowed, like she was trying to figure out if this was a joke. "I started early," she said. I came up the main trail. It got hotter than I thought, so I stopped a few times to rest. And then, she hesitated. Then I heard someone shouting, like they were in pain. I went off trail a little, and I saw you. On the ground, face down. You weren't moving. My chest tightened with a sudden, irrational drop of fear. I don't remember that, I said carefully. Yes. You do, she insisted. You were wearing that vest, that patch. She pointed to the SAR emblem on my chest. You had a cut on your forehead. It was bleeding into the dust. I checked your pulse. You were breathing, but you weren't fully there. I gave you water. I propped your head up. I called 911 and said a rescuer was down and I needed help getting you out. The way she said it, the detail she put into it, it didn't sound like a confused fantasy. It sounded like a memory, a solid one. Something in my stomach curdled slowly. I told myself this was classic heat-related cognitive distortion, hers, not mine. People under stress misinterpret, reorder, swap roles in their own story. I'd seen that before. I opened my mouth to reassure her, to steer gently back to reality. Then my radio crackled. Two voices overlapped, fuzzed, and parted. I caught only part of it. En route to male rescuer and female hiker. Last seen. Both possibly disoriented. Both possibly disoriented. I keyed my mic. Base, this is Field. I've reached the subject. She's stable. Can you confirm the original report? There was a pause, some static. Then dispatch replied. Original 911 call came from a female identifying herself as the hiker. She stated she'd located an unconscious male in SAR gear with a head injury. She was uncertain of her exact location. We pegged the call off the tower and sent you. Second team mobilized when your radio check-in was late. Late? I asked. I'm on schedule. Negative, dispatch replied calmly. You're over an hour behind expected check-in. Do you need medical evaluation? I checked my watch. The time punched me in the chest. According to the clock I was so sure I'd been tracking. I'd been on trail maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours, tops. According to dispatch, I'd been out there almost 3.5. I looked back the way I'd come, trying to piece together the hike in my head, and there were gaps. Little jumps where my memory didn't quite connect one stretch of trail to the next. I remembered starting up the canyon. Then a flash of climbing over a particularly large boulder. Then, I was here. I couldn't clearly account for entire stretches between. My skin went cold under the heat. The hiker watched my face carefully. You remember something? She said quietly. What did I look like? I asked her. When you found me. She took a slow breath, like this was going to cost her something to say. You were on your side when I got to you. Your hand was still clenched around your radio, but you weren't talking. There was blood here. She touched her own forehead, above the right eyebrow. You were breathing shallow. I called out your name, your first name. It's on your vest, and you opened your eyes for a second. You looked right at me, like you knew I was there, but like you didn't recognize where you were. I reached up automatically and touched my forehead. Smooth skin, no tenderness, no cut, no bandage, nothing. But my fingertips trembled like they expected to come away bloody. I don't have an injury, I said. I've been fine the whole hike. She shook her head once, slowly. No, you're fine now. I stayed with you until someone on the radio told me help was on the way. And then you sat up and said you had to go something about needing to get to the subject before it got dark. You sounded wrong, like you were half asleep. I thought maybe you were concussed. I had no memory of that. None. It was like she was describing someone else's day. I checked my GPS next, desperate for something solid. The track showed my route in a jagged line up the canyon to our current location, but there was a segment, about 1 kilometer long, where the breadcrumbs clustered, doubled back, tangled. As if I'd walked back and forth over the same section of terrain multiple times. As if I'd paced, or wandered. I didn't remember that either. Did you move me? I asked. No, she said. You got up on your own. You said you were the rescuer, and I was the one lost. And you had to get me out. Then you walked away from where you'd been lying, and started climbing up the rocks like nothing was wrong. The back of my neck prickled. A low roll of thunder echoed closer now, bouncing off the canyon walls. I could feel the first hint of a breeze picking up, hot and stale from below. She pulled out her phone and unlocked it with shaking hands. Look, she said. You don't trust my memory? Fine, trust your system. She opened her recent calls. There it was. Outgoing 911, time-stamped almost 2 hours earlier. She tapped into the text messages. The last incoming one from the emergency dispatcher read, "Stay with the rescuer, if possible. Help is en route for both of you. Both of you." I opened my own phone. My call log showed an outgoing test call to dispatch when I'd started the hike, and nothing after. But there, in my texts, sat a message that hadn't been there earlier. It was from the SAR base number. Subject may be assisting injured responder, it said. Use caution. Heat conditions may impact both. I hadn't seen that text. It was time-stamped during the gap in my memory. I looked at her. She looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The canyon seemed to lean in around us, the rock amplifying every small sound, my breathing, her shifting pack, the distant growl of thunder. "Do you remember falling?" she asked. I thought about it. Scrutinized every step I could bring back. I remembered starting confident, pacing myself up the incline. I remembered checking my GPS periodically. I remembered feeling the heat biting deeper into my skin, the dryness starting to creep into my throat. I did not remember falling. I did not remember bleeding. I did not remember someone kneeling beside me, tilting my head, pouring water into my mouth. But the time, those missing minutes, maybe an hour or more, were gone. "I think we need to move," I said finally, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Regardless of what happened, we're losing daylight and the storm's coming in. Second team is on the way, but we'll meet them halfway." She nodded. When she stood, she swayed slightly and grabbed my arm. "I feel like I've already done this," she whispered. "Done what?" "This climb, this exact way, with you." Her fingers tightened. "I keep getting flashes, you ahead of me ahead of you. I don't know which one is real." We started down the canyon together, and that hike felt less like moving through space and more like moving through layers of possibility. Every time we passed a certain large, flat rock, I felt a faint echo like déjà vu turned up just a notch too high. I'd catch myself reaching up to touch my forehead, half expecting pain. She kept looking back at me as if making sure I didn't vanish. We met the second team about 40 minutes later at a narrow choke point in the canyon. They looked relieved to see us both upright and apparently unharmed. They checked us over vitals, coordination, pupil response, no concussion signs, no major dehydration, no visible injuries. "You're lucky," one of them said. "With this heat, even pros can go down without realizing they're in trouble." On the ride back, I asked dispatch for the audio of the 911 call. They sent it to me a few days later. I listened to it alone. First, her call. Breathing fast, voice steady though. She reported finding an unconscious male in SAR gear. She gave a rough description of the terrain, tried to relay coordinates. In the background, faint but audible, there was a voice mind muttering something. The dispatcher tried to get her to repeat it, but she told them, "He's not making sense. He keeps saying he has to reach the subject before he loses them." Then came the internal logs, radio checks that didn't match my memory. A brief, static-filled call from my unit, my voice, sounding thick and distant, checking in from a location that wasn't where I thought I'd been at the time. On paper, everyone walked away from that mission fine. No injuries, no fatalities. Subject recovered, responder cleared. But there's a stretch of that canyon I won't go back to alone now. A section where rock, heat, and distance feel thin. Like if you weren't careful, you could slip not just off the trail, but off the track of your own day. Trade places with someone else's version of events without realizing it. People love to think rescue work is simple. Someone calls, you go, you help, you come home. But in that part of Coronado, every time my radio crackles with a new set of coordinates, I ask myself a question I never used to. Am I going out there to bring someone back? Or am I walking into a place that's already decided which version of me it wants to keep? I'd spent the last few months running a trail camera network in a remote part of Coronado, near the Patagonia Mountains, close to the Mexican border. The goal was simple: document potential jaguar movement. There have been rare sightings in southern Arizona, and we were trying to prove connectivity footprints of big cats moving north. That meant weeks of cameras sitting alone in the mountains while I went back to town, pretended to have a normal life, and waited. By the time I headed back out to collect the SD cards, fall was sliding toward winter. The mornings were cold, the days crisp and brilliant. The drive out on the rough dirt roads was uneventful. The mountains felt tired. In that way land does after long heat, like it's finally exhaling. I hiked in, visited each camera, swapped cards, checked batteries. Everything looked untouched. A few branches bumped here and there, some dust, one camera slightly tilted where a deer had probably rubbed against it. Normal. Nothing felt wrong in the field. The wrongness came later. Back at my place, a small, quiet house, not too far from Patagonia, I did what I always do. Plugged the first card in, opened the folder. Hundreds of stills. Scroll. Deer. Raccoons. Coatis. The occasional coyote. Empty frames triggered by wind and heat shimmer. Timestamps. Dates. All neat and linear. It was the kind of monotony you learn to love. The first card gave me nothing, but that normal nights, normal days, animals going about their lives. Oblivious. The second card, same thing. Some nice shots of a gray fox. A pair of skunks. One curious favelina sniffing directly into the lens, nose blurred. It was on the third card that something new appeared. At first, I almost missed it. I was scrolling quickly, half tuned out. Then my eyes caught on a shape that didn't fit. Night shot. IR flash. The usual grainy black and white. In the middle of the frame, between two trees, stood something tall, taller than a person, not shaped like any animal I knew. I clicked back. The figure was wrong. That's the only word for it. Humanoid in the broadest sense, upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, but everything slightly off. Limbs too long, head tilted just a few degrees too far to look relaxed. No visible facial features in the IR wash, just a pale oval where a face should be. It wasn't moving in the shot, just mid-stride, as if the camera had caught it crossing. But there was no motion blur. Every part of it was disturbingly crisp, despite the low light and the relatively slow shutter. I felt my scalp tighten. The timestamp, 3:47 a.m., deep night, no moon, miles from the nearest house. I told myself it could be a person. Some night hunter, some trespasser, some idiot wandering alone. But the placement, the posture, the body proportions, it didn't sit right. I clicked forward. The next frame was empty. Just the same patch of trees and dry brush. Whatever it was, had passed out of frame between triggers. That happens with fast-moving animals all the time. They trip the motion sensor just as they're exiting the view. Nothing unusual there. So I moved on to the stills from the next camera in the chain. Half out of curiosity, half out of professional instinct. If something was moving through the network, I wanted to see its path. The next camera was set a few hundred meters downslope, angled across a game trail. I opened its folder and skipped straight to its timeline around that same 3:47 a.m. mark. At 3:52 a.m., there it was again. Same figure, different angle. This time it was closer to the camera, maybe 10 or 12 feet away. Upright. Center of frame. Not walking. Standing. Facing directly toward the lens. I leaned closer to the laptop screen. The IR had washed out some detail, but I could see enough. The outline of clothing that didn't match anything modern, no seams, no logos, no texture I could identify. Its arms hung a little too straight, like it was deliberately placing them where they should go, copying a posture it didn't quite understand. The head was tilted forward, as if it were peering into the device. Again, no blur, no ambiguity. It had been there, motionless, long enough for the camera to capture it clearly. The timestamp on that frame, 3 hours, 52 minutes, and 13 seconds. The next frame, 3 hours, 55 minutes, and 13 seconds. Same distance, same spot. Same perfectly upright posture. Only the angle of the head had changed, tilting microdegrees to one side. The frame after that, 3 hours, 58 minutes, and 13 seconds. Still there, exactly 3 minutes between each shot. The camera only triggers when something moves into its field. It doesn't take a continuous series unless something is keeping it awake. Whatever was in front of it had either been moving subtly the whole time, or something about its presence was tripping the sensor regardless. It stood there, facing the camera, for 9 minutes straight. When it finally left, it wasn't caught in motion. It was just there one frame, and gone the next. I sat back and rubbed at my face, the glow of the laptop suddenly too harsh. I could feel my heart picking up. That low pressure of adrenaline that starts before you've even decided you're afraid. I checked the metadata twice. Location, date, camera ID, everything matched. There was no software corruption, no timestamps out of order. I told myself, again, that it could be a person, maybe some strange drifter, maybe someone testing the cameras, maybe a prank I didn't understand yet. But that theory died when I opened the next folder. Camera after camera, across miles of rugged terrain, recorded the same thing. Not every night, not in an obvious pattern, but enough that when I lined the timestamps up, a sort of trajectory formed. It moved quickly, much faster than someone could realistically hike between those points at night in that terrain. Yet in every appearance, its posture was calm. No signs of running, rushing, stumbling. In some shots, it was walking across frame. In others, like before, it stood directly facing the camera, as if aware of exactly where each lens was. That sent a special kind of chill through me. Because I'd placed those cameras using a system, not random, not by guessing. I'd mapped likely corridors, choke points, game trails. This thing wasn't just drifting across the landscape. It was hitting those points like it was following the same logic I had. Studying it became inevitable. At camera 14, near the edge of my grid, the sequence changed. The early night shots were normal, some deer, wind, empty frames. Then at around 2:30 a.m., the figure stepped into view at the far edge of the image. Instead of moving through, it approached. Frame by frame, I watched it draw closer. 10 feet, 7, 5, until it filled almost the entire shot, pale, featureless, wrong. Its hand, if that's what it was, held something dark and heavy. A rock. You could see the edge of it in the lower corner of the frame. The last clear image from that camera was the figure raising its arm. The final frame was a burst of static, then black. That camera had been found cracked and useless when I pulled its card. At the time, I'd blamed animals. Now, that felt naive. I opened the last folder, from camera 15. This unit was mounted slightly higher than the others, angled down onto a narrow, seldom used drainage. I hadn't expected much from it. It was more of a just-in-case unit. The folder was nearly empty. Only a handful of images over the entire deployment period. The first few, wind, a rabbit, nothing. Then, a series starting just before dawn on a cold, clear morning. In the first of that series, the camera's view was filled with the forest floor gravel, dirt, a few scattered sticks. Near the center, a small, pale shape stood just out of focus. Fingers, they looked like fingers. The angle suggested whatever owned them was crouched directly under the camera, reaching up. In the next shot, that hand was gone. Instead, in the center of the frame, small rocks had been carefully arranged. At first glance, they seemed random, a cluster, a scatter. Frame by frame, though, they took shape. Each image, more stones. The positions adjusted. By the fifth frame, there was no mistaking it. The rock spelled out a line of numbers and letters. My street address. Not the office. Not the organization's headquarters. My home. The camera's internal clock said those images had been taken around 5:12 a.m. I checked my phone records. At that exact time, on that same morning, I had been asleep in my bed, at that address, dreaming about nothing I could recall. I remember sitting there at my kitchen table, the laptop humming quietly, every small sound in my house suddenly magnified. The old fridge cycling on, a branch tapping the roof, a neighbor's car door slamming somewhere down the road. The forest didn't feel out there anymore. It felt like it had extended an invisible line, drawn straight from that drainage, through miles of trees and rock, right up to my front door. And then, it had left me a message. I know where this line ends. I reported it, of course, brought it to my supervisor, showed the images to a couple of people in the department. I watched them go through the same stages. I had confusion, forced skepticism, a creeping unease they tried to laugh off. Someone suggested I'd been doxxed, that a person could have found my address and staged the rocks as a sick joke. That idea was almost comforting in its pettiness. Human malice, at least, has rules. But who knew where all 15 cameras were? Those locations weren't public. We didn't post maps. Even colleagues who knew the general study area didn't have the exact coordinates. Besides, no one could give me a satisfying explanation for one last detail. In every single frame where that figure appeared, whether far or close, mid-stride or perfectly still, there was a technical quirk in the exposure that showed up once we really dug into it. The IR flash illuminated the terrain. Trees, ground, rocks all responded the way they should, throwing faint, predictable shadows. The figure didn't cast one. Not once. Not at any angle. It was like the world treated it as an image, not an object. A ghost in the data. I moved a month later. Packed everything into a smaller place in Tucson. Convinced myself more people, more noise, more distance would help. The organization rotated other people into the Patagonia project. I pulled back. Spent more time analyzing numbers in an office, and less time swapping SD cards, alone, in the dark. For a while, it worked. Until the first envelope showed up. No return address, no note, just a single, printed photo inside. Trail camera resolution. Grainy, black and white. My new house. Framed from an angle I recognized too well. Slightly downward, like a lens mounted on a tree. Every few weeks now, another unmarked envelope appears. Always the same quality. Always a slightly different angle. Close, far, side yard, back fence. I've changed my locks. I've installed my own cameras. They pick up cars, neighbors, cats, but whatever is taking those pictures of my house never seems to be standing anywhere a human could reach. If I'd known how wrong that feeling was, I would have turned around the second I saw them. We were in the Palisades area, high country on the edge of the Coronado National Forest. It was August, new moon. A sky so black you could almost taste it. No ambient light, no moonlit silhouettes. Just our bikes, our lights, and a lot of empty road. We'd planned a night ride for weeks, 15-mile loop, mostly Forest Service roads with a little single track. Time to finish just as the air finally cooled off from the day. We knew the area. We'd ridden versions of that loop in daylight a dozen times. We had GPS routes loaded, spare batteries, full-face helmets, the works. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing stupid. Just that buzz you get when you're doing something risky but familiar. It felt good at first. The forest at night can be weirdly peaceful when you're moving through it on a bike. Your world shrinks to the pool of light in front of you. Everything else becomes sound: tires, crunching gravel, chain ticking, your own breathing loud in your ears. The smell of pine, the faint tang of dust. Headlights sweeping through trunks, making them flash by like ribs. We'd been climbing for maybe 40 minutes when we saw them. 2 red lights, maybe a couple 100 yards ahead, bouncing gently in the dark. Taillights, just high enough to be at handlebar level. My first thought was, no way, who else is out here this late? Then the second thought hit, nice. We're not alone. I called out, looks like we've got company, and my friend laughed. We kicked up the pace a little, not pushing too hard, just curious to see who was ahead. The climb steepened, and our breathing got louder, but those red dots stayed exactly the same distance away. Far enough that we couldn't make out shapes, just twin points of light floating in the dark. Man, they're hauling, my friend said between breaths. Or we're slow, I shot back. It felt normal. Friendly competition with strangers we hadn't met yet. We had our route turned on in our GPS units. According to the track line, we were following our plan exactly up the service road. Curve left at the junction, cut across the ridge. The red lights ahead made the turns before we did, always a few seconds earlier, like they knew the trail by heart. We reached the junction we knew well, a wide, compacted patch of dirt with a big rock on the right side. Our route said go left. The red lights ahead went right. I slowed a little, coasting, confused. The road to the right wasn't on our map. I'd always thought it was a dead-end spur, or an old logging road. I'd never taken it. My friend pulled up next to me. They're going that way? He asked. Yeah, I said. Our loop's left, but you want to see where they're headed? Maybe it reconnects. It was one of those decisions that feels tiny at the time. Just a small deviation, a bonus adventure. We were both experienced enough to know when something was a truly bad idea. This didn't feel bad. Just off route. We turned right. The red lights ahead dipped slightly, as if their owners had rolled over the first little wash, then rose again. We followed, tires crunching over looser rock. The road narrowed quickly, trees leaned closer. My GPS beeped quietly, a notification that we'd left our programmed route. Road should reconnect, right? My friend called. Probably, I said. That probably felt thin. We rode another 10 minutes. The grade changed, up and down in short, sharp bursts. My quads burned, sweat ran cold down my back. The red lights never changed distance. No matter how hard we pedaled, we didn't gain on them. They just floated ahead, a constant, unbroken promise that if we pushed a little harder, we'd finally catch up. Then my GPS beeped again. When I glanced down, the track line was gone. Not just off route gone, blank. According to the little map on my bars, we were in the middle of empty space. No road, no path. Just a position marker hanging in digital nothing. My GPS doesn't show this road, I said. Same, my friend replied. Maybe it's just old. Forest Service updates are trash out here. We kept going. The surface under our wheels changed subtly. Less gravel, more hardpack with patches of loose rock. The road narrowed further, until it was more like a wide trail, barely 2 bikes across. Trees thickened on either side, dark trunks, the suggestion of branches reaching overhead. Our lights carved tunnels through them, but beyond that beam, the night felt absolute. That was when I realized something else strange. Despite following what looked and felt like a road, there were no tire ruts, no signs of recent vehicle traffic. No hoof marks from horses, no footprints. Our own tread tracks were the only ones on the surface, chalky and fresh. And still, those 2 red dots bobbed ahead. No brighter, no dimmer. I started to pay closer attention to how they looked. Every real bike light I've ever ridden behind throws some spill. Even if you're behind someone, you catch glimpses of their white headlight flaring against trees, or the halo of it on dust. These red lights had no spill, no soft glow. They were like pixels pasted onto the darkness, red, sharp, self-contained. Hey, I said. More to break the growing tension than anything else. You see any of their headlamps? My friend was quiet for a beat longer than felt normal. No, he said. Just the tails. We rode in silence after that. The only sounds are breathing and the tires grinding against the ground. A few minutes later, the road did something that made the hair on my arms stand up. It narrowed so much, it was barely wider than a game trail, then dipped into a shallow gully. But the red lights ahead stayed exactly the same height, gliding smoothly, unbothered by the change. They didn't bob more on bumps. They didn't dip into the gully, then rise out. They just floated. I felt it then, that cold prickle that starts at the base of your skull and slides down your spine. The part of your brain that's older than language whispering, something's wrong. I checked my GPS again, hoping for some kind of reassurance. The screen, which had been blank, now showed our position icon, moving slowly into an area shaded in gray. Not mapped, no contour lines, no features, just a patch designated as roadless. The red dots led us deeper into it. Hey, I said, louder now, I think we should turn around. This doesn't look right. My friend's light swung as he glanced back, his face pale in the glare. I've been trying to say that, he said. I feel off. Like we've been climbing forever. We both slowed. For the first time since we'd started following them, we stopped pedaling. Ahead, the red lights kept rolling forward for about 2 seconds, like they hadn't noticed. Then they stopped too. They hovered. Exactly the same distance away, exactly the same height off the ground. We waited, straddling our bikes, chest heaving, sweat cooling on our skin. The forest around us pressed in, all depth erased, beyond the reach of our beams. No insects, no wind, just the faint rumble of our freewheels and our heartbeat in our ears. Then, as we watched, the red lights ahead shifted, not forward, not backward. They spread. 2 became 4. 4 became 6. 6 became 8. A line of red points slowly fanned out across the path ahead, forming a shallow curve. They hung there in the dark, motionless, unblinking. They didn't drift. They didn't flicker. They just multiplied. I can't describe the feeling of that moment properly. It wasn't like seeing animals. It wasn't like spotting other riders. It felt like standing in front of a row of eyes that had just turned to look at you. I realized then that my light was hitting nothing past a certain distance. The trunks I thought I saw beyond those red dots? Gone. The beam just seemed to die, like it was being swallowed. The road ahead vanished into blackness a few feet before those lights, as if whatever they were hanging above wasn't attached to the same ground I was on. My friend whispered, "That's not right," which was the understatement of the century. "Okay," I said, voice tight. "We're done. We're turning around. Now." We both swung our bikes around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart felt like it was hammering against the inside of my helmet. Just as we started to push off, gravel scattering under our tires, something happened that nearly made me drop the bike entirely. The red lights moved again. One by one, they began to shift from ahead of us to the sides. Left, right. The semicircle they'd formed started to curve, extending out and around until those red points were no longer just in front, they were sliding into our peripheral vision, left and right, like a pair of arms stretching outward to close around us. We didn't wait to see the full shape. We ran. We didn't ride gracefully or strategically. We just dumped every bit of power our legs had into the pedals and tore back the way we thought we'd come. Branches slapped at our shoulders. Rocks jolted up through the frame. My front wheel slipped, caught, corrected. My friend's light bobbed wild beside me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if those red dots had turned to chase us. The weirdest part, and the thing that still messes with my head, is that I don't remember making any turns. No junctions, no forks. We'd come in on what felt like one continuous path, but the ride out felt shorter, compressed. The trees thinned faster. The road widened quicker than it had narrowed. Within what felt like minutes, we burst back onto the familiar junction with the big rock. The real Forest Service road sat in front of us like a lifeline. My GPS map snapped back to normal, track line reappearing under our wheels. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. Inside that cab, windows up, doors locked, the world felt suddenly small again, contained, manageable. My hands shook as I took off my helmet. My friend stared straight ahead, breathing like he'd just finished a race. We didn't talk much on the drive home. There's a certain kind of fear that doesn't want words yet, because saying it out loud makes it solid. The next day, we pulled the GPS data from our units, half hoping to prove it had all been in our heads. The track showed a clear divergence from our planned route at the junction, then a strange, jumbled mess of lines. The device had recorded us moving into that gray, unmapped patch, but the breadcrumb trail doubled back on itself over and over. Like we'd crisscrossed the same short section of road, again and again. According to the data, we'd only traveled a couple of miles past the junction, total, but the elapsed time didn't match. There were gaps in the recording that didn't line up with our memory or our feeling of effort. We went back out with a group a few weeks later, in broad daylight, just to prove to ourselves the road was harmless. When we reached the junction, the spur to the right was still there, narrow, rough, inviting in that explore me way. But 100 yards in, it dead-ended into a wall of rock and brush. No extended trail, no long descent, no corridor for anything to lead us through. We've never found that long, narrowing stretch again. Now, when I ride at night, and I still do, I'm religious about a rule I never would have thought to make before. If I see lights ahead on a road that doesn't exist on my map, I don't follow them. Because in that part of Coronado, not every light you see in the dark belongs to someone trying to get home. Some of them are trying to get you off the road you thought you were on. And if you let them surround you, you might not find your way back to the version of the trail you started on. I've been an entomologist for most of my adult life. Bugs were my comfort zone. Other people got creeped out by them. I found them reassuring, predictable, efficient. Insects don't do anything without a reason, and their bodies are shaped by physics and evolution in ways that make sense once you understand them. You look at enough of them, you start to recognize rules. This shape means it can fly like this. This leg structure means it lives in that kind of habitat. It's like reading a code. The day this happened, I was in Cave Creek Canyon, one of the most beautiful, biologically rich parts of Coronado. Rocky boulder fields, towering cliffs, water seepage that keeps little pockets lush even when the rest of Arizona is baking. It's an entomologist's playground. It was May, prime collecting season. The kind of day where the sun is bright but the air still holds some coolness from spring. I'd been there since morning, working my way through a patch of huge granite boulders, flipping rocks, scanning bark, checking crevices. My collection vials were already clinking with live ground beetles, rove beetles, a couple of click beetles, some smaller species I'd need a microscope to sort out later. Everything was normal. Then I flipped one particular flat rock and saw something that made me pause, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked so correct. If you've done field work, you know what I mean. Sometimes you lift a rock and the insect under it seems like a textbook illustration of what should be there. The perfect representative. That's what this beetle looked like. Sleek black body, shiny, elongated, not too wide. Long legs, slightly curved antennae. It moved in that smooth, confident way of something that knows exactly how its body works. I'd seen hundreds of beetles with that general shape before. It didn't scare me. If anything, I was excited. It looked like it might be a nice specimen of some carabid I'd cataloged a few times, but never in this specific microhabitat. I popped the vial open, coaxed it in with a brush, snapped the lid shut, and moved on. Another sample for later. Nothing strange. The first weird moment was small, easy to ignore. I flipped a second rock a few minutes later, and there it was again. Same kind of beetle, same smooth black body. Same size, same proportions. I thought, great. A whole little population under this boulder cluster. That's interesting data. By the fifth rock, I realized every one of these little population beetles looked identical. Not just similar. Identical. Same size down to the millimeter. Same slight notch on the wing covers. Same tiny asymmetry in the antennae segments. It was like someone had copied and pasted the same insect over and over. That actually happens sometimes in nature, at least to a degree. Some species are just extremely consistent. But my instincts started ringing anyway. I've handled enough specimens to know when something is just a bit too perfect. Still, I pushed it aside. Mental note. Unusually uniform beetle morph in boulder field, investigate later. I kept collecting. By midday, I had several vials of them. What really broke things open wasn't the field work, it was when I sat down on a flattish rock, pulled out my hand lens, and took a closer look. Up close, every insect tells you a story. The wings, the joints, the mouth parts, they all say, this is what I do, this is how I live, this is what I eat. I brought the first one up to the light, lens in front of my eye, and focused. At first glance, it matched my expectation. Elytra, the hardened wing covers, nicely shaped. Head tucked under a slightly raised pronotum. 6 legs, articulated as they should be. Then I looked closer at the legs, and everything in me went cold. The joints bent the wrong way. Not all of them, just enough. Insects have a specific pattern to how their legs segment and flex. It's one of those rules you can count on. On this beetle, the segments existed. They were all there, but the joint angles didn't make sense. The second segment bent backward more than forward, in a way that should have made it impossible for the beetle to walk the way it had under that rock. If it tried to move the way its skeleton suggested, it should have dragged its abdomen or tripped over itself. But I'd watched it. It moved smoothly, like everything was working fine. I told myself it was an anomaly, a deformity. That happens too, so I put that one aside and pulled out another. My heart started to beat faster, not from exertion, but from a deep, creeping disbelief. Same exact structure. Same physically impossible leg configuration. The odds of 2 deformed specimens, identical in their wrongness, in the same spot, were vanishingly small. I checked a third. Same thing. I moved to the head, telling myself I was imagining it, that I was tired, hungry, misinterpreting. Under the lens, I focused on the eye's compound, as expected. Composed of many tiny facets. Only these facets weren't arranged in any pattern I recognized. Usually, insect eyes tell a simple story: curvature, facet size, density. This thing's eye. At first, it looked normal. Then, as I shifted the angle, it didn't behave like a curved surface. The reflections didn't move the way they should. It almost felt like the eye was flat, but rendered to look curved. Like a texture painted onto a shape that didn't match the underlying structure. I pulled the lens away and stared at the beetle in my palm. To the naked eye, it looked perfectly ordinary again. just a little black beetle, thumbnail-sized. It twitched its legs, looking for purchase, probably stressed from handling. I put that vial down and picked up a different one, almost daring whatever was happening to keep going. Under magnification, the mouthparts were next. In beetles, you expect to see a certain layout, mandibles, palps, all arranged for biting, chewing, maybe scraping. On this thing, the mandibles existed, but they didn't connect, like they were just sitting there, decorative, attached at points that wouldn't give them leverage. If this insect tried to bite down, there was nothing for the force to push against. It was like someone who'd seen a diagram of a beetle's mouth had sculpted one from memory and messed up the engineering. That's when a thought slid into my head that I really didn't like. It looks like something that's trying to pass as an insect. I don't mean camouflage, I mean structurally. As if it understood the idea of beetle, but not the function. Like a mimic that got 90% of the way there and assumed no one would check the fine print. I was sitting there, halfway between wanting to catalog it and wanting to drop it and walk away, when the forest around me seemed to come into sharp focus. I realized how quiet it was. Cave Creek Canyon normally hums birds, insects, leaves, water if you're near a stream. But in that little boulder field, the sound seemed dampened. Not absent, exactly, but softened, as if I were hearing it through a layer of cotton. I told myself it was in my head, that what I was feeling was just intellectual discomfort. I collected, because that's what I was there to do. I added more of the strange beetles to my vials, labeling them carefully. Location, time, microhabitat. My notes were clinical, even as my hands were not entirely steady. I didn't feel outright fear yet, just unease. That came later. When I started noticing something else, the more rocks I flipped in that area, the fewer normal insects I saw. It's hard to describe if you haven't spent years doing this. Under rocks, you expect life in layers. Tiny spiders, ants, soft-bodied larvae, occasionally centipedes. Variety. In that patch, it was mostly just those beetles. Over and over, like they'd outcompeted everything else. Or replaced it. At some point, I realized I'd been collecting them for hours. The sun, which had been high and bright when I started, had shifted toward late afternoon. Shadows stretched longer between boulders. The light took on that gold that means you either start heading back or prepare to be out in the dark. I headed back. If this were a simple ghost story, something would have happened on the hike out. A sound, a shape, a chase. Nothing did. The canyon looked the way it always had. The air warmed as I left the shade. My truck was where I left it. I drove back to my lodging and spent the evening being normal, shower, food, emails. It wasn't until I sat down with a dissecting microscope that night that the real horror began. Under high-quality optics, those beetles stopped being just weird and became something that truly did not belong here. The first one I examined, I focused on the elytra. The wing covers looked perfect, smooth, glossy. I expected to see tiny imperfections when magnified, scratches, wear, microscopic dust. Instead, it looked uniform in a way that didn't make sense. Not smooth like polished wood, smooth like a rendered surface. My brain kept insisting there should be texture where there was none. I moved to the abdomen, the segmentation. Insects have certain constraints. Their bodies have to fit nerve cords, digestive tracts, reproductive organs. The way segments stack and interlock is the result of all that. On this specimen, the segments overlapped in impossible ways. There were nested plates that couldn't physically allow an internal cavity of sufficient size for organs. In other words, there was no room inside this thing for it to be alive. But it had moved. I checked the others, hoping to prove that one was an anomaly. One after another, they showed the same impossible anatomy. Eyes that didn't curve correctly. Joints that couldn't transmit force the way they would need to. Segment overlaps that left nowhere for the systems of a living insect to go. I made detailed sketches, photographed everything, put together a quick, messy report draft. My rational mind took over. New species, it whispered. Extreme adaptation. Maybe a parasite. Maybe some unknown strategy. It clung to those ideas like life rafts. The next morning, I went back to the lab to start real analysis. I had carefully preserved several specimens in ethanol, one in a dry vial, one pinned. I opened the cabinet where I stored them, already planning the sequencing steps, and froze. The ethanol vials were cloudy. Not just a little. Milky. When I picked one up and turned it, the beetle inside didn't tumble like it should. It smeared. The shape distorted, as if it were made of something soft. Panicking a little, I poured the contents into a glass dish. What slid out was not a preserved insect. It was a formless, gelatinous mass of dark tissue. No segmentation, no joints, no recognizable structure at all, like someone had melted the beetle from the inside out. The more I looked, the more it resembled a clump of organic matter, with no organization. I checked the other ethanol vials. Same thing. Heart pounding, I went to the pinned specimen. It lay there on the foam, pristine, too pristine. Under the microscope, it still looked like an impossible beetle. I tried to probe a leg with a fine needle. It collapsed at the slightest touch, crumpling inward like ash. No resistance, no internal support. The entire specimen began to disintegrate where I touched it, the black surface flaking away into dust that left no trace of its former structure. Every sample I'd stored either dissolved or collapsed under investigation. I sent the images and my preliminary notes to a couple of colleagues. Most of them responded with the same mix of excitement and skepticism you'd expect. Fascinating. Are you sure about the preservation protocol? Could be contamination. Maybe an artifact of dehydration. One, though the oldest, most sober-minded researcher I know, called me instead of replying by email. I walked him through everything. The field collection, the identical morphology, the impossible biomechanics, the disintegration. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "If your observations are accurate, and I believe they are, what you collected out there was something mimicking insect form without understanding the constraints of being an insect. Like a copy of the appearance, not the function." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "Mimicry has a purpose. Evolution doesn't produce mimics that can't actually live." "I didn't say it was evolutionary," he replied. "Just be careful, and don't publish this yet." "Why not?" "Because if you put this out there and it's real, you're not just describing a new species. You're describing something that doesn't belong anywhere on our tree of life, and people are not going to react well to that." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept seeing those beetles as I'd first found them under the rocks, moving confidently, as if everything about their bodies worked perfectly. As if the universe had quietly suspended its usual rules for them, just in that boulder field, just long enough to let them pretend. Since then, I've been back to Cave Creek a few times. I've searched those boulders, hands shaking a little more each time I flip a rock. I've never found those beetles again. Not one. The normal life came back: ants, spiders, larvae, the usual messy variety. It's like that entire little population, or projection, or whatever it was, got turned off. Here's the part that keeps me up sometimes. If that's what I saw in one canyon, on one day, with one group of insects, what else out there might be running similar tests, in other forms? How many things have we glanced at, cataloged, filed away as just another species, without ever checking closely enough to see if they're structurally impossible? So now, when people send me blurry photos of weird bugs and ask if it's a new species, I look more carefully than I used to. I look for the rules I know, and for the cracks where they don't apply. Because I used to think the forest just hid unknown life things we hadn't discovered yet. Now I'm not sure that's all it hides. Sometimes, I think it's also where something else is learning how to look alive, and isn't quite getting it right. That's why what happened on Carr Peak still bothers me more than anything else I've seen in Coronado. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a scream in the dark. It was the sun, not doing what I watched it do. I was on Carr Peak to shoot a sunrise time-lapse. That's it. Nothing supernatural. Nothing even especially adventurous. I'd done it before. The view from up there is ridiculous valleys stretching out forever. The sky, huge and clean. In December, if the weather cooperates, you get crystal clear air, sharp shadows, and that slow, dramatic burn of light crawling across the landscape. I hiked up in the late afternoon, well ahead of dark. Snow in patches, but the trail was manageable, packed down from other boots. Cold, but not life-threatening. I had my tripod, a mirrorless body, a wide lens, extra batteries tucked inside my jacket so they wouldn't die in the cold. Routine. I picked my spot just below the summit, facing southeast. I'd already done the homework, sun charts, compass bearings, past shots from the same location. I knew, within a couple of degrees, where that bright disk would break the horizon line. I even pulled up an app to double-check. It matched my memory. It matched my notes, everything agreed. I set the tripod. Locked it down. Checked the bubble level. Framed the scene. Valley floor in the lower third. A slice of silhouetted ridge to the left. A wide expanse of sky overhead. I took some test shots as the light faded, more for focus than anything else. Then switched the camera into interval mode, one shot every 30 seconds, once the first hint of dawn started. Night up there is a strange thing. You're not deep in the trees, so it's not that suffocating, enclosed darkness. It's exposed. The sky turns into this dome of stars that makes you feel way smaller than you want to admit. The cold sharpens every sound. My sleeping bag crinkling. The tiny click of my gloves against metal when I adjusted the tripod. The distant creak of ice somewhere on the trail. I dozed in short bursts, waking up every so often to check the time, to check the sky, to make sure the camera was still where it should be. The world was exactly what I expected. Cold, clear, silent, familiar. Just before dawn, that faint light started to show a softening of the black. A hint of gray pushing against the horizon. I turned on the intervalometer. The camera obediently started its rhythm. Click, whir, pause, click. Then I just watched. If you've ever really watched a sunrise alone, you know it doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. It's slow, subtle. The sky brightens by imperceptible degrees. The stars fade. Shapes emerge from the dark. I stood there, breath puffing in front of me, feeling the stiffness in my fingers, looking exactly where I knew the sun would appear. And it did. A pale, sharp edge cutting into the horizon line, exactly where I expected. Southeast, slightly to the right of a particular bump in the ridge that I always use as a visual reference. I remember thinking, there you are, with this weird, childish relief, like the universe had passed a test. Light spilled over the valley, shadows shortened, then stretched, then sharpened. Frost on distant trees flashed silver. It was the kind of sunrise you dream about as a photographer. Clean, crisp, predictable. When the sun was fully above the horizon and the light turned from golden to harsh, I stopped the interval, checked the last image on the screen just to make sure the file count made sense, then packed up. My toes were numb. My face burned from the cold. It was time to go down. The hike back was uneventful. Snow, rock, trees, the usual careful descending. Once I hit the trailhead and then the road, I stopped thinking about the sunrise and started thinking about coffee and heat and maybe a nap. It wasn't until later that afternoon, sitting in front of my computer, that the world I thought I understood quietly shifted. I loaded the SD card, copied the files, opened them in my editing software. There were 180 frames, give or take, about 90 minutes of that gray to gold transition. I selected them all and ran a quick preview as a slideshow to see how the time-lapse would flow. The first few frames looked normal, dark, then lighter, shapes emerging, the valley floor taking form. The color grading of the pre-dawn sky looked exactly like I remembered. Then the sun broke the horizon. Except, it wasn't where I'd seen it. In the time-lapse, that first bright edge didn't appear over the southeast ridge bump I'd memorized. It rose from a point almost 40 degrees to the left. Due east, a totally different section of the horizon. Clean, perfect, wrong. I paused the sequence, scrubbed back and forth, checked the metadata on those frames. They were from the correct time. No corruption, no skipped images. The camera hadn't moved, the foreground rocks were in the exact same place, from shot to shot. The composition matched my test images from the night before. Nothing had shifted. According to the time-lapse, the sun had risen in a part of the sky I knew in my bones I had not been staring at. You might think I misremembered, that my sense of direction was off. So did I. At first, I pulled out my notebook. On the page where I'd sketched my composition, I had marked the ridge bump and drawn a little arrow. Sun here. The arrow pointed to where I remembered seeing it. Southeast, not east. The time-lapse said otherwise. I went back to the raw files, one by one. Zoomed in. Checked for lens distortion that might explain the discrepancy. Nothing. My focal length was wide, but not extreme. Lines were straight where they should be straight. That ridge bump was exactly where it should be in frame, and the sun was nowhere near it. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling that same cold I'd left on the mountain seep back into my body. At some point, I told myself, fine, you're human. Maybe you oriented yourself wrong in the dark. Maybe what you remember isn't accurate. So, I opened up an astronomy program and plugged in the coordinates and time. Carr Peak, this date, sunrise. The software drew a neat little arc, the sun's path for that morning. It matched the time-lapse, not my memory. According to every piece of external data I had, app, chart, timing, the camera captured reality exactly as it was supposed to be. So why did I vividly remember watching the sun rise from somewhere else? I could have written it off as a weird psychological blip if it had stopped there. It didn't. Going through the sequence frame by frame for exposure adjustment, I noticed something else. A brief, subtle dimming around the midpoint of the time-lapse. Not a cloud, there had been no clouds. Not a glitch, no dropped frames. Just a moment where the light over a section of the valley went slightly darker, like a small shadow had passed across it. I scrubbed back to find the exact frame. Zoomed in. It was a shadow. Cast over a swath of trees and rock. Crisp-edged, clear, as if something large had passed between the sun and the landscape. I panned up in the same frame, expecting to see a plane, a bird, something, anything to explain it. There was nothing. The sky in that frame was pristine. Blue-white. Empty. I checked the preceding frame. No shadow. The one after, no shadow. Only in that single 30-second slice of time did something enormous block light in a way the camera could see, even if my eyes hadn't. My heart started pounding. I checked the exposure settings, thinking maybe the camera had randomly underexposed that one image. Nope. Same shutter, same aperture, same ISO. Histogram shifted as if the scene itself had darkened, not the camera's interpretation of it. So I had two conflicting things now. My memory versus the sun's position, and my eyes versus the camera's experience of something crossing the valley. I pulled out my notebook again. In the margin, I found something I'd written without thinking much of it at the time. Weird moment around mid-sunrise, felt like clouds, but sky stayed clear. I'd forgotten about that. I'd felt a slight change, a subtle dimming, the way you notice when the sun ducks behind a thin cloud. Only, standing up there, I'd looked up at the sky instinctively and seen nothing. Just that empty, blue-gray brightening. The camera, however, had caught the consequence of something I couldn't see. A moving shadow on the earth. I tried a different angle of attack. Maybe there was a plane, a high-altitude jet. I checked flight tracking logs for that morning over that grid. Nothing at that time in that exact area low enough to throw a shadow like that. And certainly nothing that would only appear in one 30-second slice and then vanish. There's a particular flavor of dread that comes when instruments and perception disagree. If everything had been weird in the moment, I'd say, I saw a thing. Maybe it was a trick of light. Maybe I was tired. If everything had been normal in the footage, but my memory was strange, I'd say, I misremembered. But this was the opposite. The camera saw a version of the world consistent with math and sky charts, and something extra I couldn't see at all. My body remembered something else entirely. For days afterward, I kept replaying it in my head. Standing on that slope, looking toward that ridge, watching the sun emerge exactly where I expected. I remembered it too clearly, which meant one of two things, and neither sat well. Either my brain had somehow rewritten my memory after the fact to match what I expected, even though I later learned it was wrong, or for a tiny, impossible window of time, I'd been standing in a version of that morning where the sun rose from a different part of the horizon than any chart or camera would ever admit. The shadow bothered me more though. I started isolating those frames, playing with contrast, drawing masks over the darkened region. Based on the size of the shadow and the time interval between frames, whatever cast it would have had to be enormous, hundreds of feet across, maybe more. Too slow for a meteor, too fast and too low for anything conventional, and completely invisible to the naked eye. I showed the time-lapse to a couple of other photographers I trusted. I didn't tell them what to look for at first, just asked for impressions. They all said the same thing. Beautiful. Then, the sun's a little farther left than I'd have expected from that vantage. And finally, after I pointed out the frames, that's odd. One of them tried to comfort me. Look, you probably remember the last time you shot from there. Brains mix things up, and that shadow could be sensor weirdness, IR reflection, who knows. I wanted to believe him. But at night, when the house is quiet and the only light is what I turn on, I think about standing on that mountain with two sets of truths trying to exist at once. The one in my skin, my eyes, my memory. The sun rising in one place, the light dimming for a heartbeat for no visible reason. And the one in the data, the sun rising somewhere else, exactly where it should, while something massive and unseen briefly passed between it and the earth. I've been back up there since. I've shot other sunrises. They've behaved. The sun comes up where the charts say. Shadows behave. The world feels locked in again. But I can't shake the feeling that on that particular morning, for reasons I don't have the tools to understand, whatever holds reality steady around Carr Peak slipped. Just a fraction, just long enough for the camera and I to disagree about something as fundamental as where the day begins. So when people talk about glitches in the matrix and laugh, I don't. Because I've stood in the cold with my hand on a tripod, feeling the warmth of a sunrise I watched with my own eyes. And then gone home to proof that, according to every measurable thing we trust, I wasn't actually looking where the sun was. Something else was there. And my camera was the only one honest enough to admit it. That's what Rustler Park did to me. Not the trees, not the shadows, the sound. I was there for work, not for thrills. I record soundscapes for documentaries and research birds at dawn. Wind in the pines. Distant thunder rolling over the mountains. Rustler Park, up in the Chiricahuas, is perfect for that. High elevation, dense, mixed conifer forest. A strange quiet that makes every little noise feel important. I arrived late afternoon, gear loaded on my back. The park had that off-season emptiness campground, mostly deserted. A few old fire rings, some picnic tables, no people. The air was cool. The light turning towards that soft, golden angle. If you looked only with your eyes, it was beautiful. If you listened, it sounded wrong. Not obviously, not at first. There were birds, a breeze nudging needles, the occasional creak of a tree shifting. But underneath that, there was this thickness, like the silence between those sounds had weight. Whenever I stood still, my ears strained for something that wasn't there yet but felt like it was just about to be. I've recorded in enough places to know when I'm imagining it and when I'm not. I picked a spot a little ways away from the campground, gentle slope, good mix of trees, no running water to overpower everything else. I set down my pack and pulled out my main recorder. It isn't a normal audio setup. This one captures a huge frequency range from way below human hearing into ultrasonic. 2 standard mics, 2 specialized low-frequency pickups anchored to the ground, and a recorder that can gather everything from subsonic rumbles to bat calls. The idea was simple. Capture the transition from afternoon to night. Birds giving way to insects, wind shifting, maybe coyotes in the distance if I got lucky. I planted the low-frequency sensors in the soil, screwed the mic stand into place, aimed the capsules out into the trees, and hit record. The little red LED came on. That always feels like opening a door. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. The standard mics picked up the expected mix, some sort of jay screaming in the distance, the high, thin calls of smaller birds, the shush of wind. The low-frequency channels showed a little baseline rumble from distant thunder beyond the range of the standard mics. Nothing unusual. I sat on a log a few feet away, headphones on, eyes closed, just monitoring. That's when I heard it. Not with my ears at first, with the meters. On the recorder's screen, the sub-20 Hz channels started to wake up. There were tiny movements, little blips where the line should have been flat. It looked like something was pushing up from below the audible range rhythmic, but not like thunder, too regular. I bumped up the monitor gain on the low end and shifted the pitch in my headphones so I could hear it. It's a trick you learn over time. You can't hear infrasound directly, but you can transpose it into your range to get an idea of what's there. At first, it sounded like nothing, just vague pressure. Then the shape of it started to come through. It wasn't wind. It wasn't distant vehicles. It wasn't any natural low-frequency pattern I knew. It sounded like a voice. Not words I could understand, just the cadence, rising and falling in a way speech does. Pauses in the right places. Little microdynamics that didn't belong to distant thunder or shifting earth. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was fascination. This is what experience does to you. It makes you curious when you maybe shouldn't be. I told myself it was something odd with air currents in the trees. Or maybe some combination of forest resonance and distant storms. I marked the timestamp in my notebook, noted strange LF pattern, and kept listening. Then I heard my name. Clear. Undeniable. Daniel. Not in the normal audio band. Not as a whisper in my ear. In the shifted, stretched version of that low-frequency recording, the sound resolved for a moment into something perfectly shaped like my name. I froze. The little hairs on my arms rose. Every instinct screamed that I'd misheard, that my brain was pattern-matching random noise into something familiar. It's a well-known phenomenon. Humans love to find meaning in chaos. So I did what any sound person would do. I rewound the buffer and listened again. This time, I watched the waveform while it played. At the exact moment I heard my name, the LF channel showed a distinct shape, a little swell, a sharp peak, a decay. It didn't prove anything, but it looked unlike the more random patterns around it. I took the headphones off and listened to the real world. Silence. A breeze. A distant crow. Nothing that sounded like me. I put one ear cup back on, half in, half out, splitting my awareness. The low-frequency voice, if that's what it was, came through again. Daniel. North. 40 meters. North. Each word elongated, stretched to fit into a range I shouldn't have been able to perceive directly. But with the pitch shifted, it was understandable. Calm. Almost conversational. I laughed. A short, nervous sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. I checked my watch, checked my phone, checked my mental state. No dehydration. No low blood sugar. No drugs. Just a guy in a forest with too much equipment and too much imagination. Still, my body had already done something. Before I'd fully processed the words, I'd stood up, and I was facing north. I hadn't realized I'd turned until I saw the compass on my pack strap and noticed its needle. I looked back at the recorder, still sitting on the log. The screen glowed softly. The low-frequency channels remained active. Little bumps, little pulses. 40 meters. That strange, altered voice had said. I told myself, "You're falling for auditory pareidolia. Sit back down. Let the recorder do its job." Instead, I took a step. The forest didn't change dramatically. Same trees, same light fading through the branches, same faint wind. But I became sharply aware of the rhythm of my footsteps, the crunch of needles, the soft thud of boots on earth. In my headphones, under the normal sounds, that low pattern adjusted. It started to match my pace. Not perfectly, but close enough that I noticed it. When I stopped, the pattern shifted. When I moved again, it seemed to swell in time. I went exactly 40 meters. Old habit. You get used to estimating distance in the field. About 45 yards. I counted steps. When I hit roughly that point, the voice came through again. Slightly clearer now. Good. Just that. One word. Deep, slow. Sitting just on the edge of what I could convince myself was real. I did something then that I'm not proud of. I followed it further. Not because I believed it was wise. Because there was a part of me, some stubborn professional edge, that wanted to see how far the coincidence would go before it broke. For the next 15 minutes, it gave me instructions. Directions. Distances. Left. 20 meters. Downhill. 10. Stop. It never once used cardinal directions again, just relative movement. And every time I obeyed, the anxiety in my chest eased just a fraction, like I was scratching an itch I didn't know I had. That's what scared me more than the voice itself, the ease with which my body started listening to it. My rational brain kept trying to cut in. You're following a voice in your headphones, in the woods. This is how people disappear in stories. But another, quieter, strangely persuasive part of me thought, it knows where you are. It knows how you move. It hasn't hurt you yet. I only snapped out of it when I tripped. My toe caught on a root. I pitched forward, slammed my hand into the ground, and the headphones were knocked askew. One ear came free, the other slid back so only the edge of the cup rested on my head. The forest roared back in wind, branches, my own curse under my breath. For a moment, the sound in the headphones and the sound in the real world fell out of sync. The low voice kept talking, but my body wasn't aligned with it anymore. Right, Daniel. Right. 3. I yanked the headphones off. The silence that followed felt violent. No voice, no instruction, just the ordinary, indifferent noise of the forest. My heart was racing. My palms were scraped. My knees throbbed. I realized I had walked far enough away from the recorder that I couldn't see the red light anymore. The sky between the branches had darkened considerably. I checked my watch. I'd been following directions for 40 minutes. It had felt like 15. That was enough. I turned around and started back, using my footprints and broken twigs as guides. With each step away from that point, the pressure I hadn't fully acknowledged eased, like descending from high altitude, and only then realizing how thin the air had been. When I got back to the recorder, it was still running, battery strong, red light steady. I stopped the recording with hands that shook more than I wanted them to. I didn't listen to it there. I packed up as the light faded, loaded everything onto my back, and walked out of Rustler Park with the very strong sensation that something wanted me to stay longer. I didn't look back. That night, in the safety of a cabin with solid walls and electricity, I plugged the recorder into my laptop. I isolated the low-frequency channels, converted them into something my ears could properly hear, and hit play. It was all there. Not perfect, not crisp, but undeniably, horribly structured like speech dragging itself through mud. My name, multiple times. Directions, distances, evaluations, little murmured words that didn't sound like mine. And underneath those, woven through like a second layer, were things I hadn't consciously heard in the forest. Dates, places, personal details. My childhood street name, the town where I went to grade school. The hospital my sister died in when I was a teenager. All of it stretched into infrasound, nearly lost, but present. When I reversed the audio, some of it got clearer, like the information sat closer to the edge of perception that way. There is no earthly reason any low-frequency atmospheric phenomenon in Rustler Park should know those things. I checked the timestamp against my GPS track. The first time it said my name happened 5 minutes before I remember noticing anything strange. The directions started before I acknowledged taking that first step. My body had begun to respond before my conscious mind caught up. I sent a segment of the recording to an acoustics lab I sometimes work with, stripped of identifying information. I told them it was low-frequency data from a forest site and asked what they made of it. They ran analysis. They came back with something like this. There are structured patterns here not typical of natural phenomena. Some elements resemble speech envelopes, but they're outside normal frequency bands. Also, your subject, they meant the signal, appears to anticipate changes in the recording environment by fractions of a second, as if it knows when certain sounds will occur. What do you mean, anticipate? I asked. They sent a graph. Peaks in the infrasound rose just before my own footsteps, registered on the regular audio, like something was reacting to me slightly before I actually moved. If this were human speech, their report said, we would say the speaker was responding in real time. But because it precedes the associated events, it suggests a predictive or pre-coupled pattern. Predictive, pre-coupled. They were being careful not to use words like intelligent or aware. Scientists are allergic to those without proof. But I'd been there. I'd felt how easily it slipped under my guard. I haven't gone back to Rustler Park with recording gear since. I still work in forests. I still love them. But there's a new line in the mental checklist now. Birds? Good. Wind? Good. Sudden, deep, word-shaped pressure in your chest that seems to know your name and prefers you not to think too hard about where your next step is going? Turn around. Because if something in those trees has found a way to talk to you in a range, your body feels more than hears, and if it's been practicing long enough to learn your details, your patterns, your history, then the only question that really matters is this. How many decisions in a place like Coronado feel like yours? And how many are just you following directions you never realized you were given?